I wanted to discuss I guess, NATO expansion and the Western narratives, how they've developed over time, and indeed the extent to which we've been trapped in them. Because we already know from the 1990s that many American leaders, well as European, political leaders and military leaders, they warned against expanding NATO. While there were benefits, they also recognized that this would be perceived by Russia as a threat. Yet, what was common sense in the 90s has now become, somewhat controversial and often dismissed as Russian talking points. And, I'm not sure if we do ourselves any favors by portraying reality in this way. But you, coming from such a high level position in the CIA, when you look back at the 90s, so what did you see was the main concerns within the US intelligence community and indeed the European one as well regarding NATO enlargement and the potential impact on relations with Russia?
Well, when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, the Warsaw Pact broke up, and then ultimately the Soviet Union itself broke apart. There was a big question that arose in the West, both in Washington and in European capitals, which is, okay, what is our foreign policy about anymore? For more than a generation during the Cold War, we had a very clear purpose. It was to contain the Soviet Union, to ensure that Europe would not be subject to yet another great power conflict, to make sure that the states in the Western Bloc did not fall prey to communist ideology and Soviet domination. We knew how to do that. We established deterrence militarily, and we put in place a series of rules and institutions that were designed to minimize the risks of direct warfare, which everybody knew would go nuclear and would be catastrophic for everybody involved and for the entire world. So we knew what we were doing, and we had worked out how to achieve the goals that we had during that period. Then suddenly there's no more Soviet Union, there's no more Warsaw Pact, and I think people in Washington and Europe said, "Okay, so what do we do now?" And we came to a judgment, and the judgment essentially was, well, the Western community that we had built during that Cold War period was very successful. It ensured prosperity for the people in that bloc. It worked out very well in providing for their security. And we thought, proved the superiority of our ideology in the way the Cold War ended. So we thought, well, let's extend that Western community and make it a world community. Let's globalize the Western system, which means we'll take those old Warsaw Pact members and we'll transform them. We'll help liberalize them, reform them from within. And we'll do the same thing with Russia. We'll transform Russia. We can re-engineer it socially and politically to look like the West. And we even extended that to the Middle East, thinking that liberalization of states there would stabilize that region, end the chronic instability that the Middle East had suffered from for so many decades. And that didn't work out. We bit off far more than we could chew. We tried to do things that we really weren't capable of. And when you think about how hard it is to engage in social engineering in your own country, in a political culture that you know intimately, whose political system and players you know extremely well, social engineering inside countries seldom works out very well. Now try to do that in foreign cultures that you really don't understand, with histories and ways that you don't, you're not steeped in. So what happened was essentially this NATO enlargement was based on the idea that if we extend the security umbrella of the NATO alliance, we extend EU membership, that will foster the westernization and liberalization of these countries. The problem with that, in addition to being unachievable, was the Russians said, "Hey, wait, that's not what we were envisioning. We thought that when the Cold War ended, we would be accepted as a co-equal in the Western community. What you're offering is subordinate status, being some sort of junior partner, a rule taker rather than one of the rule makers alongside the United States and others. We don't see a role for us in this expanded European community that you're building. We have no say in how that operates. We're simply supposed to do what we're told. And on top of that, we're supposed to accept a NATO military presence on our borders. That's not a deal that we're willing to accept. Those terms are not attractive for Russia. Now, the people in Washington and to, I think, a great degree in Europe that had developed years and years of expertise in the Soviet Union, that understood that system, that were vital to containment and the rules of the game that we put in place so successfully during the Cold War. Almost all of them said, wait a minute, if you're going to start expanding NATO and bringing it closer and closer to Russian borders, there's going to be a reaction. The Russians are going to feel threatened. They're going to feel as if they're being surrounded and treated as the other rather than as a part of a broader Europe. And that reaction is going to be more and more intense the closer the NATO alliance gets to Russian borders. So in the mid 1990s, when this issue was under discussion in Washington, it was basically a case where most of the Russia experts at that time said this is crazy to try to expand NATO. But what was regarded as completely, unthinkable at that time, this is 1994, 1995, 1996, was the notion that you would go beyond some of the Warsaw Pact nations and bring core elements of the former Soviet Union into NATO, such as Ukraine. That was unthinkable among the people who were the Russia experts at that time. And it's remarkable now in retrospect for me to think back at the discussions that were taking place in Washington at that time and just how completely unimaginable it was then to think that we would be trying to bring NATO into Ukraine or Ukraine into NATO. And now this seems to be, conventional wisdom. Of course, Ukraine has the right to choose its military allies. Of course, the host nation can choose what military forces it wants to host on its territory. This is almost a sacred principle that no one is questioning, and I think it's really at the root of the conflict that we've got right now. And understanding these dynamics are critical, not because they justify a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not a justifiable invasion. It's illegal, shouldn't have happened. And there's no question that the Russians made the decision to invade and should be held accountable for that. But to argue that it was completely unprovoked, Putin woke up one morning and said, yeah, I really would like to have Ukraine as part of my country, I think is ignoring the history and the dynamics that shaped this decision. And if you don't understand those dynamics, you're not going to find a way out of the war that we're in right now. Your peacemaking efforts will be unsuccessful.
Well, what was strange though